we adjust. So thank you, Sanjeev. So I'm anticipating lots of questions that will ask you to sort of flesh out that wonderful framework we just laid out. So Christine handles this side of the room, I handle this side of the room. So hopefully we won't miss anybody this time. So doors open as people get in. We'll take about, the usual thing is about take a few questions at a time and then so Sanjeev, yeah, go ahead.
Can we put it all down? Sanjeev, this proliferation, not proliferation, but the strength of this spontaneous plan, isn't that also a response of the inadequacy of state planning? You know, I think of things like sidewalks being used to park cars or for small vendors, things like that. Or, you know, open spaces being used as open toilet by poor people. So isn't that one reason why, you know, the state plan is so inadequate to address the needs of people that you have this other plans?
Next, no? I think we're sure.
I have a little basic question.
Why don't you just come up? It's easier for.
Hi, this is a relatively basic question regarding how do we define urban. If I'm correct, the 1971-81 definition of defining urban by 400 people per square kilometer and the municipality boards and the cantonment boards coming in, we have data right now available for us for 30-meter Landsat imagery. We have got night light imagery, and there's a lot of good micro-precision data. So is there a need of defining urban spaces differently?
My name is Suresh Rohila. I happen to be also have worked on the planning of regional plan. I was one of the conveners of 2011 plan, one of the former directors of NCR Planning Board. I wanted to understand what you had. You kept on mixing projects with plans and, you know, programs with plans. That is something which I found was a bit of catchy situation. But every state evolves its solutions on planning within constitutional frameworks. And India planning is basically a public sector activity. There's no doubt about that. And the plan has been prepared within that framework. The planners cannot go beyond that because that was constitutionally mandated. Okay. But there are also processes involved. Whatever you are saying, I think I can assure you that when I was handling this plan, there were processes that every sector represented in these committees and all those things, they were, whatever you said, anticipate or adapt, all those things have been taken into account. But there's a question of scale at which you play. Okay, now if you try to say that if there is a political manifesto and political reason that DMIC is coming in and that's why you should adapt to this thing, these are political things, you know. They have to also respect the plans. So I don't think there is a major thing, but only thing is you're mixing up the different scales of plan, what I'm trying to say. A regional plan is there, was there, and people were supposed to respect that. And the sectoral plans have been taken into account while framing these plans. It is not that they were not taken into account. But at the scales you might have missed out these Behror and these small points. It is there, it's a regional plan. It cannot look at that particular scale. The state was supposed to, and state brings together these things to the regional plan, and that gets accommodated. And when you see a scale at 30,000 square kilometer area being planned, you will miss out those small things. So regional plan is supposed to do only the broad contours of the region, not try to address these things that the state has to represent. And that's the process. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
So, sure, Smita, go ahead. We have rescaling, we are redefining. And so.
Thank you very much for that excellent review. You spoke in the end of the planning process moving out of a state-centric domain. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate more on that because that seems almost counterintuitive.
You spoke of planning, but in public administration we have, read that urban planning is purely on transportation, industrialization, and the way of the people work there, the nature of the people. So it amounts to various ingredients that has to be taken into account because of the various segments are to be placed in such a way that there is not a logging of those people. And for that, I think the planning like Chandigarh and other cities, which are supposed to be the smart cities, they are doing very well. So, but you have not taken those parameters into the full frame. Is your planning is something different from the urban planning which the people in 70s or 50s thought?
I'm going to take that and then we'll come to second.
All right. Excellent questions. Thank you. I'll try go one by one. You're very right. The strength of informal plans at some level speaks to a certain weakness in the formal plans. And as I said, the manner in which planning was conceived in the Nehruvian period, and Sunil Khilnani's big critique of the time is that Nehru's lasting legacy was institution of the state at the central of Indian imagination. So state was going to do everything. It was going to provide you housing, send you to school, run airlines, take you traveling, right? RTDC is a great example of this, and ITDC, and take you to the hospital. State was going to deliver every single thing. We know by 1970s it did not work out, right? Late 1960s was a terrible time. The two wars with Pakistan and war with China, right? So it's well documented. And I believe there was a moment in time when that lively planning tradition froze and became ossified in rock, right? That only the state will do planning, nobody else. And that model lingers on. At the level of state, we still believe, we still think that it's the state that'll make the plan. So we made Chandigarh in 60s, 70s, worked out great. One of the best cities, some of the best cities in India were conceived in 60s, 70s. Can we do it again? I'm not so sure. I think the very notion of planning is beginning to move away from its state-centered exercise. And that review of planning literature sort of points out that planning scholars are now revisiting. What is planning? Why do we need to do it? Do we need to do it for capitalistic excess, right? That's the neoliberal critique. That planning invariably serves as a court gesture in the court of powerful rulers, or as an instrument for making more profits for the capitalists. And we're saying, no. Planning is neither of the two. If we do it intelligently, it helps us anticipate and adapt. Not only the state, other actors, institutions, organizations, social groups, civil society, households, individuals, everyone can do planning. And the beauty of a democratic exercise promoting individual flourishment is when everyone is involved in planning, not the state. We don't trust the state historically. We know state first takes from us and then gives it. We know historically it takes land from poor farmers and gives it to people they want, right? So that's the dynamic which I was trying to sketch out broadly. I'm a planner guy, as I said, right? So I believe in the power of planning to deliver good. And planning can actually, it has historically delivered good in the post-independence period. So that's one. The second is definition of urban. I think that question is very timely. I did not use the word urban and rural to the best of my ability unless I was evoking a certain continuum. I'd like to think of planning as spatial, as those maps showed. Where does urban stop and rural happen is very, very difficult to track. So think of this as spatial. Wherever people are aggregated in space and live in close proximity, that's spatial. But for census purpose and governance purpose, we do need that, right? But that's a false dichotomy. Planners have historically sort of believed in the continuum of urban and rural, and where you define it, I think that answers the question. And regional planning, absolutely. That's the broadest scale at which planners conceive of it. and a state has the wherewithal and the power to do things at the regional scale. But then the frameworks, the planning frameworks, the way we have conceived of planning as an activity in the country needs to loosen up and facilitate other kinds of plan. That's easier said than done. But then that's where the way, that's the direction in which we conceiving of plans increasingly. In most of the world, unless it's a third world country at this point in time, or a very centralized state, most places planning has moved away from a state-centered focus. It increasingly fosters other peoples to make plan. More on the lower scale than upper scales. At higher scales, still state plays a central role because it needs to coordinate across jurisdictions. So I think that's where the answer of that lies. And how's planning moving away from state? I think that's increasingly easy to see. So not only the domain of spatial planning, but if you see education, or if you see health, or if you see smaller things like provision of parks, it's other actors. I would call them non-state actors, rather than saying only the private sector, that have begun to emerge and increasingly supplementing or working with. I think of this as a dynamic play. There are certain things that state does better than others, and there are other things that private sector does better than the state, and it's the interplay. And as Indian democracy continues to deepen and matures over time, we would hopefully find a balance as to what's best done on the state side and what's best done on non-profit side and what's best done on the private side. So did that cover the 5 questions, Partha? More or less? I'm open to more talks over tea in a little bit.
Question time here sort of goes on to questions that it's
Okay, all right.
You may take it along, please. Why don't you just come up and use one of these free microphones?
Good evening. My name is Regit Matthews. I'm from WRI, India. Thank you for the good summarization of sort of planning in India. I have 2 questions actually. In fact, some of the plans that you showed as a consultant, I've been part of some of them, not very proudly, but yes. I have 2 questions. Would you look at sort of what is the next step in terms of, has planning worked, state-led planning in India? We've looked at some assessments of, say, master plans. Sometimes they have single-digit implementation success rates, sometimes double-digit. And we've seen that town country planning acts, many of them are which sort of vestiges of British acts in India. Those countries themselves have moved on a long way from that and are looking at alternates. So would you look at then what if it's not working? That's one question. Second, also, what is rural today is urban tomorrow. Most of our city peripheries, metropolitan peripheries are that way. Would you look at sort of urban and rural agencies coming together as one, as an option, as a solution, and make it more geography based rather than trying to draw a line between urban and rural? Does that work? Thank you.
How can I take this question right now and then we move on? Sure. This really is up my alley. I love this question. I agree with both the assessments you make. This is, and I think the turning point or that moment of crystallization happened somewhere in 70s and 80s, where we sort of stopped. And this sort of was not only true of spatial planning, but other domains, industrialization, right? So a definitive history of this is yet to be written. But most countries sort of moved away from that conception of planning around the same point in time. And the time is right that we need to revisit some of our notions. Planning actually works in most places. One of my professors in the US has sort of made a very ambitious claim, and I like it very much, that most people do not think of United States as a planned country. The state does not make centralized plans. There are very few plans. Like Chicago region has not had a master plan since 1965, but it's a different kind of planning, and he claimed that United States is the most planned country in the world. Every single thing is planned, but it's a different kind of a planning than a state-centered plan. And I think in India, we're now beginning to have pieces in place where people are interested in planning. Coming together of so many people in a warm on a warm afternoon itself is an example of this. So planning is important. People know good plans help improve the quality of life. How would we do it is the question. And that's a question for all of us. If our generation does not do it, maybe the next one's got to do it. But somebody needs to start paying. And this would not be imported this time. We can learn lessons. It would have to be informed deeply by our cultural context, our polity, and our uniqueness of being contemporary India. And that's a larger debate than we can perhaps tackle. The second is rural-urban. I think that's a fascinating question. And unless we think of the two together, they might be, there are, the census is sort of, there's enough literature on this in one of the current project I'm working on sort of looks at it in quite detail. But the rural-urban dichotomy we know does not work as far as spatial planning is concerned. And this needs to be paid attention at a very fine-grained level. And for that we need many more people who are sort of looking at this. At this point in time, it's constrained by political jurisdictions, mandates as to where the urban region stops, so planners do not look beyond it, but absolutely, that's the way to sort of look at the two together. Thank you. Other questions, please?
I'm Philip Oldenburg, I'm a political scientist, and I'm a bit confused. I take it that there is no longer such a thing as unplanned development. That any development that occurs is planned by someone. That suggests to me, again, as a political scientist with a certain amount of state focus, admittedly, that someone has to decide, or someone has to referee, or someone has to enforce something. And what is the mechanism that you foresee as an appropriate and just way of melding, shall we say, planning from the bottom and planning from the very top?
Can I have a writing question?
Sure. I have Manoj first.
No. It's related to this one.
Thank you very much. I am Manoj Roy. I am coming from Lancaster University, UK. I am visiting Delhi, so took this opportunity to listen to this fascinating talk. I just one question, really trying to understand the philosophy of planning. I mean, I like your idea that you began with planning being a futuristic sort of corrective, betterment sort of activity, and then you kind of exercised and took us through these different ideas and what's happening in India. And towards the end, I was just thinking, probably my brain was looking for some, theorization from your point. What I was thinking that probably is that the state level planning that you mentioned, probably that is a very liberal activity, that when they exercise every, 5 years or 10 years, they actually accumulate all this knowledge that is coming from even the unplanned four dimensions, but they try to really kind of to be more democratic, more accommodating in their next version of the plan. In that sense, could you not really theorize that these NCR being much more democratic, much more sort of reflective, not just forward-looking, but they are really building on what has been learned from these 4 different planning. In that sense, you really bind all these 4 different elements in the next version of the state plan. From that point, I really agree on that concept of saying, where is the state? Are we state really missing? I'm sort of thinking that you could really draw that philosophy. The state is also sort of much more liberalizing in that sense. On that point also, I just wanted to note that whether this idea of judging our city planning to be a rigid one-time solution is probably wrong. For example, we cannot criticize the Chandigarh planning now, thinking that after so many years it will serve the same purpose. Probably the same sort of hybrid sort of changing has happened. So we need to really revisit as in the way we see the top level planning accommodating the past 5 years lessons, perhaps the city level planning also need to be thinking in that way. That could be one theoretical aspect I was just thinking. Whether you really thought when you will be sort of summarizing your findings, do you expect to come back to to the state level planning with a different sort of vision in that sense? That's sort of my question. Thank you.
Just a question that, did you get a chance to scan through the 73rd, 74th amendments, which provides you local to regional And neither the local works, neither the regional works. Okay, there have been 25 years now. The state does not respect anything, and neither any of the actors in this respect any of the things. That's what is happening. Except one or two states, even the constitutional amendment, which is 73rd, 74th Amendment, which allows for local area plans or, practice, even if it was to happen, do we have enough people to plan for these 8,000 so-called urban centers, or how many planners? So I want to see that which kind of world you are anticipating in India, the urban centers, which direction to go. Talking about urban practitioners in developed world is fine, and you have various models, but over here both systems have existed, both things have not been respected. Special Act of Parliament, NCR plan, gives the powers, it doesn't work. Constitutional amendment which ensures that every state allows for local plans has not worked.
And I think we had,
Yes, thank you. My name is Pierre Guyot, I'm a French architect. Thank you for the talk. I would like to have your point of view on the ongoing smart city policy and how this process might or might not be the opportunity to interconnect the various kind of plans you talked about, and how this gives us like clue on the direction that planning is going to in India. Thank you.
we answer that set first, then we can.
Okay, great questions. Phil, and I think there is a common strand in the questions at some level. My purpose in sharing this was to sort of paint the bigger picture, right? I mean, this is what my work reveals is what's going on. So before I moved into theorizing, I didn't want to be prescriptive, right? I didn't want to give a model or sketch out an outline as to what needs to be done. But of course, the questions point out in that direction. The state historically, and even today, plays a central role, because that's, right? So from a political science perspective, I do not challenge the legitimacy of the state to undertake these exercises. But within the Indian post-independence period, the state decided, on one hand, to take on more than it has historically delivered in this context, and on the second hand, it failed to do so, as rightly pointed out, right? So 73rd, 74th Amendment now go back. These essentially, for the people who are not aware, they sort of tried to empower and institutionalize local governance, both in urban areas and rural areas. We know that the law, as passed by the parliament, stands now for 25 years. The regional plans for Delhi, extremely liberal documents, extremely liberal. But then they promise much more than what state can actually deliver, right? So that is the mismatch. And that's not only for the state to think about, but for us as larger people and society to think about, so what kind of planning model would work here? We have a colonial legacy, we have a post-colonial legacy, we have a Nehruvian legacy, and it's the layers of these legacies that sort of shape how the state tries to play its role. So that's why I stopped short of theorizing it, but I think the answer, of course, lays in the direction you point out, that we would have to figure out modalities with which we can sort of take first the stock of these plans. That's what's going on. How do we improve on it? You rightly pointed out, every 5-10 years, whenever planners make plans, they sort of do a survey of what's happening, and they try to incorporate it. Number of planners in this country itself is a matter of great concern. 4,000 people for a country of 125 million, right? So to put it in perspective, United States has, the APA claims a membership of more than 80,000 planners for 1/4 the size of the population, right? 80,000 and 4,000, and 125 million and 300 million, right? So it's the state overreach, inadequate capacity, and all of that that we are aware of. But nonetheless, good plans can make a difference, and that's what I was trying to point out. I think the smart cities, just like the preceding JNNURM, which was the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, So on one side is the sloganeering associated with the idea of smart cities and glamour and all that, and the other side, this is I think both of these centrally sponsored programs are a great step forward. That the center is actually giving money to states and cities and saying, we realize that you cities are becoming important, the quality of life is deteriorating, here is central funds, right? It's like giving out money for free. Historically, Delhi has always taken money from the state and other cities. This is rare that Delhi goes out and gives you money for nothing and says, here's some money, add your own and make changes. That's part of the larger shift that India as a country and as a society and as a state is beginning to pay attention to cities, backed by actual monies, right? So I think of smart cities as the growing commitment of the central government towards ensuring that the quality of life and basic infrastructure in smaller cities and the most important cities of the country begins to improve and does not go down any further. That's how I sort of make sense of this conceptually in my head. Does that answer some of the questions? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Sudev, I'm a student of history. And my question is that one way that I see planning in Western developed countries to be different than in India is that in India, some basic municipal services and other goods and services that cities are seen to provide still haven't made it to the people that require it. And I'm thinking about the Delhi master plans, the successive master plans. After a series of various land acquisitions and other kinds of plans that the DDA made, it was really coordinating service provision that the MCD was not able to provide that often led to some of the haphazard growth that we see in the city, or maybe we can even call it non-mandated as you do. So I was just wondering, from your perspective, in the last 10 months you've done field work in Delhi, what role do you see the MCD providing and municipal services on a broader level in relation to the planning that you're kind of outlining for us?
So what do you think regarding the status of migrated laborers in the urban space? Because I have read that many of these migrated laborers are facing citizenship and identity crisis when they come to urban space for earning their livelihood. So what exactly is for them in this planning and the role of state and other stakeholders for their at least a residential stay in the urban space? Thank you so much.
Hello, Cindy. I want to bring back the discussion to the central question that you were raising. That you talked about American cities, and you said that they don't for their regional plans and perhaps master plans. And then you also suggested that these cities are highly planned cities, and we could see that. My question is then, what is the thing called plan that you have in mind? What is the definition of the term plan? Is it orderly development of a city, like the instrumental view of planning, or something else like a collaborative planning exercise, or entirely something very different? Because entire discussion would depend on how you define the word plan. This is a question.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you would consider that this change from formal state-driven planning processes to these more organic plans that seem to come about whether it's because we have also in the Indian context specifically seen a change in the nature of the way the public and general non-planning stakeholders engage in this process. And at least at the formal level, you see plans like the CDPs, the environmental impact plans, sanitation plans, requiring buy-in from the local in a way that never had happened before. It's mandated in the guidelines. So is this also, would you say, it's fair to say that it is part of this process where the public wishes to and is demanding for different kinds of engagement in this process?
I see plan, whatever term you might call it, as some allocational decisions being taken, right? In that perspective, one of the changes. What I would like to know is that what are the changes that you see in the allocational mechanism, and in whose benefit?
Let's answer that.
All right. I'll start with the history question. I think you raise an important point. Municipal services is something that sort of I think of as the implementation domain of plan rather than plan making activity that I discussed. But remember, this was historically and even today, this is one of the poorest parts of the world, right? Where only about 20, 30 years ago, even food security was a big issue. More recent scholarship has sort of has described how the annual growth rate in this country over the first 50 years of independence was about 0.1% on the average. So, and the first budget of the Union of India, 1948, was less than the budget of New York City for that year, right? So, we have not been successful, and per capita housing availability has kept going down until almost 1980s and 90s, and so on and so forth. So much needs to be done on this, and in many cities and across many states, delivery of municipal services continues to be an issue. How much it has improved over time, I haven't looked at the more recent data, but I imagine that continues to be an issue. And
is that a separate literature than, say, planning literature as such?
Yes.
I'm not
Yes. So more on urban and municipal governance and provision of services.
Because I'm saying in the case of Delhi, if you look at the series of master plans, the mini master plans that came in between were largely amendments made to address issues that arose because services weren't provided. So in a way, I mean, in the Indian case, I feel like it's much more integrated of a question. I mean, in the US, no one knows who's running for city council, for example, but everyone knows who's running for a municipal ward council in Delhi. So I just wonder if somehow we can incorporate that into the discussion.
Sure. Well, that would be an interesting scheme, but unfortunately, I haven't explored it in great detail. But I'm sure you can find that data. And in pockets, you would see improvement. And that sort of comes back to the allocational questions. And that's been a big critique of planning, especially that done by the state, that for every allocational decision we make, we deny some other people who get that good or amenity. I sort of see the answer of this in the larger democratization of the planning process as and when it happens. If we begin to sort of do planning at the scale of towns and villages or neighborhoods in India, just like it happens in other parts of the world, where we might have a regional plan, but no city level plan, and each area, let's say 50,000 people, and they make their plan, then that allocational problem gets taken care of. Otherwise, if we're trying to do it at the city scale, then allocation always remains an issue. Because we know historically South Delhi tends to get much more than what East or North or West gets. So I think that's where the debate is stalled at this point in time. And allocation remains a major outcome of planning rather than the job of planning at the level I was talking about. I was trying to sort of repurpose what we mean by planning and how we can do that better. But allocational questions remain important. I'm not so sure about the stakeholder buy-in process. I think it's sort of, I haven't seen outcome studies that document how much that involvement has improved the quality of plans or their perusal or implementation or what actually happened on ground. But nonetheless, the idea itself is meritorious that more people need to be involved in the process. Could we imagine a situation where people make their plan and sort of present it to the government and say, hey, here's a plan we have made. Do you want to critique it, or can we adopt it for our own purposes, right? So that's where I think some of this lies. This goes back to what you just mentioned, that municipal boards and councillors, if they are empowered and if they are really engaged with the community, that's what 74th and 74th Amendment sought out to do. Is Indian democracy and cities ready for that state? More recent literature talks about not at the level of not at the level of states. State chief ministers apparently hold on to as much power over cities as they can, because cities are engines of economic growth, right? So if we were to have a choice between CM of Maharashtra and CM of Mumbai, I think most people politicians would want to be CM of Mumbai rather than Maharashtra, right? So it's that kind of, but that's a larger political, social question than what is within planning. I think labor issues, cities historically have been first conceived as labor markets, and that's fundamental to the way cities work. Unfortunately, in most Indian cities, we haven't paid much attention to this, fueling the informal, tacit, and spontaneous plans in many instances. So that's something which is up for discussion, and I think the time is ripe as cities continue to attract increasing number of migrants. Ashokji, your question is at the heart of the talk, and as I said, I imagine or define planning as a future-oriented activity that different actors and institutions undertake in order to anticipate and adapt planning, in order to anticipate and adapt for an uncertain future. So it's an important exercise. State is important because at some levels, as rightly pointed out, only the state can coordinate, but not at every level, right? Individuals can do their work, households do their stuff, social groups and communities can do this, but maybe at the level of regions where we have to coordinate bigger things like transportation or regional water supplies, where individual communities might not be able to do it. So it's a matter of scale, and but the purpose is to anticipate and adapt, not to define and govern and control. So that old distributional aspects of planning or instrumentalist versions of planning or technical oriented of planning, imaginations of planning have sort of given way. We know transportation plans at certain level work, roads work, and multimodal transportation models work. So it's not turning back from technical planning completely, but it's increasingly sort of paying attention to place-based, people-oriented planning rather than only a certain version of planning. Thanks.